1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. When German POWs first saw American guards riding colorful bicycles with balloon tires and chrome fenders around the camp, they burst out laughing, calling them Kinderspielzeug, children's toys, proof that America was too soft and incompetent to win the war. But within weeks of riding those same bicycles, hardened Wehrmacht soldiers began experiencing a psychological collapse that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What did these prisoners discover about American power that their own propaganda had desperately hidden from them? And why did a simple bicycle become the symbol of everything they'd been taught to deny? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the scorching summer of 1943, the Nazi war machine still rolled across Europe with brutal force. German soldiers marched under swastika banners, believing themselves destined to rule the world for 1,000 years. Radio broadcasts from Berlin filled their ears with promises of final victory. Newspapers showed maps with arrows pointing to triumph. Every young man in the Wehrmacht knew one simple truth, taught since childhood. Germany was superior in every way. Their engineering was the finest. Their discipline was unmatched. Their enemies, especially the Americans, were soft, lazy, and hopelessly backward. The propaganda painted vivid pictures of American weakness. Posters showed fat businessmen smoking cigars while their factories produced junk. Radio announcers mocked American culture as shallow and decadent. German soldiers were told that Americans couldn't even build proper tools or weapons. They were a nation of children playing at war, certain to crumble when faced with true German strength. This wasn't just military talk. This was treated as scientific fact, as obvious as the sky being blue. Among those soldiers was Klaus Schneider, 24 years old, who had worked in a Stuttgart factory before the war. He knew machines. He understood metal and precision. He had helped build motorcycles with parts measured to the millimeter, where every bolt had to fit exactly right or the whole thing would fail. German engineering wasn't just good, it was perfect. Klaus carried this certainty with him across North Africa's burning sands. Even as British tanks rolled toward his position near Tobruk in May of 1943. The capture happened fast. One moment, Klaus was firing his rifle at distant shapes through the dust. The next moment, British voices shouted for surrender. His ammunition was gone. His commanding officer was dead. Klaus raised his hands with a dozen other men, their faces covered in dirt and defeat. But even in that moment of surrender, Klaus held on to his beliefs. The Allies had won this battle through numbers, not skill. Germany would still win the war. It was only a matter of time. The journey to America took weeks. Klaus and hundreds of other prisoners crowded into the dark belly of a ship, crossing an ocean most had never seen before. They whispered to each other in the darkness. America would be terrible, they agreed. Primitive. Probably they would be worked to death in coal mines or shot trying to escape. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty and chaos. When they finally stumbled onto American soil, squinting in the bright sunlight of a New York harbor, Klaus expected the worst.
Instead came buses, long transport trains, miles and miles of countryside rolling past the windows. Klaus pressed his face to the glass and stared. Farmland stretched to the horizon. Towns passed by with neat houses and paved roads. Telephone poles marched in endless lines. Cars, so many cars, moved along the highways. This wasn't the bombed-out wreckage he expected. This looked untouched by war, whole, wealthy. Klaus felt the first small crack in his certainty, though he pushed it away quickly. The train carried them deep into Kansas, where the land flattened into endless prairie under an enormous sky. When they finally arrived at Camp Concordia in June of 1943, Klaus and his fellow prisoners climbed down from the train cars, stiff and exhausted. Guards with rifles watched them carefully, but didn't shout or strike anyone. The prisoners formed ragged lines and marched through the camp gates, expecting brutality at any moment. What Klaus saw instead confused him completely. The camp spread out across acres of flat ground, with rows of clean white barracks arranged in perfect order. Guard towers stood at the corners, yes, but everything looked new and well built. An American flag snapped in the wind above the main building. And everywhere, moving between the buildings and along the dirt roads, American soldiers rode bicycles. Klaus stopped walking and stared. Several other prisoners noticed too, and quiet laughter rippled through the group. The bicycles looked completely wrong. They had fat tires much wider than any bicycle Klaus had ever seen in Germany. Shiny chrome fenders curved over the wheels. The frames were painted in bright colors, red and blue and green, not the sensible black that serious bicycles should be. Some even had baskets attached to the handlebars, like something a housewife might use for shopping. A guard rolled past on a bright red bicycle with white stripes on the tires. The bike had springs on the front fork and a wide leather seat. It looked comfortable. It looked expensive. It looked ridiculous. Klaus glanced at the man next to him, a mechanic named Werner from Munich. Werner's eyes were wide with disbelief. Kinderspielzeug, Werner whispered, children's toys. Other prisoners heard and grinned. The word passed down the line in quiet German voices. Kinderspielzeug, Kinderspielzeug. Klaus felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with contempt. These were the people who were supposed to defeat Germany? These Americans who rode around on toy bicycles with pretty paint and soft seats? Real bicycles were made of heavy steel. They were built for serious work, for carrying loads and traveling long distances. They needed to be strong and simple. These American bicycles looked like carnival prizes, things won at a fair and ridden once before breaking. As the guards directed the prisoners toward their assigned barracks, Klaus watched more Americans pedaling past. Not one of them seemed to think there was anything strange about their bicycles. They rode casually, sometimes with one hand, chatting with each other as they rolled along. One young soldier had a bicycle with a horn attached to the handlebar. He squeezed it twice, making a cheerful honking sound, and waved at another guard. Klaus shook his head slowly. The propaganda had been right, after all. Americans were children playing games. They built toys and called them tools. They rode silly bicycles around their camps and probably thought they were being efficient. How could a nation like this possibly win a war against German engineering and discipline? It seemed impossible. It seemed laughable. But as Klaus walked into the barracks and claimed a bunk, as he looked around at the clean floors and the real mattresses and the windows with glass that wasn't broken, a tiny voice in the back of his mind asked a question he didn't want to hear. If Americans were so foolish and weak, if their manufacturing was so terrible, then why did everything here look so new and abundant and well-made? Why did even their silly bicycles shine in the sunlight without a spot of rust?
Klaus pushed the question away and lay down on his bunk. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight, he was just glad to be out of the war, even if it meant being a prisoner of fools who didn't know how to build a proper bicycle. The second week at Camp Concordia brought a surprise that made the German prisoners laugh even harder. During morning assembly, an American officer with a friendly smile announced that bicycles would be available for prisoner use during their free time on evenings and weekends. The prisoners could check them out from the recreation building and ride them anywhere within the camp boundaries. Several men translated the announcement for those who didn't speak English, and the whole group erupted in amused chatter. Klaus stood with Werner and a few others, shaking their heads in disbelief. This had to be some kind of test or trick. Perhaps the Americans wanted to see which prisoners would try to escape on the ridiculous bicycles. Or maybe this was meant as an insult, forcing proud German soldiers to ride children's toys. Werner made a joke about racing to Berlin on a bicycle with a basket, and everyone around him laughed. Klaus laughed too, but something about the offer felt strange. The Americans seemed completely serious. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of Klaus and a dozen other prisoners. They walked to the recreation building where rows of bicycles stood lined up against the wall. An older guard named Sergeant Morton showed them how to sign out a bike by writing their name and barrack number in a logbook. No locks, no chains, just trust that they would bring it back. Klaus selected a blue bicycle with wide white striped tires and chrome fenders that caught the sunlight. Up close, he could see the brand name stamped on the frame: Schwinn. Klaus lifted the bicycle and nearly dropped it in surprise. It weighed almost nothing compared to the heavy steel bikes back home in Germany. The frame felt thin, delicate. He squeezed the tires and they gave under his fingers, soft and cushioned. This bicycle wouldn't last a month of real use, he thought. The paint would chip, the thin frame would bend, the soft tires would go flat on rough roads. He looked at Werner, who had chosen a red Western Flyer model, and they both grinned at the same foolishness. Klaus threw his leg over the bike and pushed off, expecting it to wobble or creak. Instead, the bicycle glided forward smooth as water. The wide tires rolled easily over the gravel path. When he hit a bump, springs on the front fork absorbed the shock, and he barely felt it. Klaus pedaled faster, and the bike responded instantly, light and quick under him. He squeezed the handbrake, and it stopped smoothly without any grinding or squealing. His grin faded into confusion. Over the next few days, Klaus found himself riding the blue Schwinn every evening after work detail. At first, he told himself he was just amusing himself, passing time in this strange captivity. But really, he was testing the bicycle. He rode it hard over rough ground. He took sharp turns. He braked suddenly. He left it outside in the rain one night, certain the chrome would rust. Every time, the bicycle performed perfectly. The frame didn't bend, the tires didn't fail, the paint didn't chip. After a week of abuse that would have destroyed a bicycle back home, the Schwinn still looked and rode like new. Klaus started noticing other things too. He watched American guards ride their bicycles to their posts every morning and leave them leaning against buildings all day in the hot sun. Nobody performed maintenance. Nobody oiled chains or checked tire pressure. Yet the bicycles never seemed to break down. One afternoon, Klaus saw a guard riding a bicycle that looked at least 5 years old. Its paint faded, but everything else working fine. How was that possible if American manufacturing was so poor? The camp stored hundreds of these bicycles in long sheds behind the recreation building. Klaus peered through the window one day and counted row after row of identical red Schwinns, all brand new, still waiting to be used. Hundreds of bicycles, just sitting there. Back in Germany, bicycles were precious. You inherited them from family members or saved for months to buy one. Here, the Americans had so many they couldn't even use them all. Then came the Coca-Cola truck. Klaus was riding past the camp canteen when a large red truck pulled up with cases and cases of brown glass bottles. 2 workers unloaded them while whistling a cheerful tune. The guard at the canteen explained to some curious prisoners that they could buy Coca-Cola with their camp scrip, the paper money prisoners earned from work details. Klaus had heard of Coca-Cola from propaganda that mocked it as sugary American garbage. But when he finally tried a cold bottle that evening, the sweet fizzy taste was like nothing he'd ever experienced. And the Americans had truckloads of it, truckloads, just for a prison camp. The mess hall shocked him even more. 3 times a day, prisoners lined up with metal trays and received portions that seemed impossible. Fresh milk in glass bottles. White bread, not the dark heavy bread of Germany. Real butter, not margarine. Meat at every dinner. Sometimes chicken, sometimes beef, sometimes pork. Klaus remembered the rations back home before he deployed. Already getting smaller, already missing key items. His mother had stretched every meal, used every scrap. Here, American prisoners of war ate better than German civilians had eaten before the war even started. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Klaus began riding the bicycle to different parts of the camp, exploring during his free time. He rode to the library, a small building filled with books in English and German. He rode to the work areas, where prisoners helped with camp maintenance. He rode along the perimeter fence, watching the Kansas prairie stretch away forever under enormous skies. And every time he rode, he felt the same strange feeling growing stronger. These bicycles weren't built just for function. They were built for comfort, for pleasure, for the simple joy of riding. One evening, Klaus sat on a bench near the barracks, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. Werner sat next to him, also quiet. Finally, Werner spoke in a low voice that the others couldn't hear. "These bicycles don't break," he said simply. Klaus nodded. They both understood what that meant, even if neither wanted to say it out loud yet. Klaus started checking out books from the library, teaching himself better English with a worn dictionary and a grammar book. He watched how the American guards treated the prisoners with casual respect, sharing cigarettes, asking questions about Germany with genuine curiosity. A young guard named Jimmy showed Klaus pictures of his family's farm in Iowa, pointing out the barn and the fields and the animals. Jimmy asked about Klaus's family in Stuttgart, whether they were safe, whether Klaus had siblings. The kindness felt alien and confusing. At night, lying on his bunk, Klaus thought about the bicycles. In Germany, everything was built only for its purpose. Strong, heavy, serious. A bicycle was for transportation, nothing more. But Americans built bicycles that were light and comfortable and pretty. They painted them bright colors. They added springs and cushioned seats and chrome fenders that served no function except to look nice. They built pleasure and beauty into even their simplest tools. What kind of nation did that? What kind of people had so much abundance that even prisoners got more food than they could eat and could ride bicycles just for fun? Klaus had been taught his entire life that Americans were weak and foolish. But weakness didn't build hundreds of perfect bicycles. Foolishness didn't create this much food and organization and casual plenty. Klaus rolled over and stared at the ceiling. The question he'd been avoiding finally forced itself into his mind and wouldn't leave. If the Americans were so inferior, so incompetent, so doomed to lose the war, then why did everything here work so perfectly? Why were their toys better than Germany's tools? And if the propaganda had lied about the bicycles, what else had it lied about? The blue Schwinn waited for him outside, gleaming in the moonlight, ready to carry him wherever he wanted to go within these fences. Klaus closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. Something fundamental was shifting inside him, something he couldn't stop or control. The bicycle had become more than a bicycle. It had become a question he couldn't answer, a crack in everything he thought he knew. Thanksgiving Day arrived at Camp Concordia on a cold Thursday in November 1944. Klaus had been a prisoner for nearly 18 months now, and the seasons had turned from blazing summer to frozen winter and back again. He had settled into the rhythm of camp life, working on maintenance crews during the day and riding the blue Schwinn bicycle during his evening hours. He had read dozens of books from the library. His English had improved enough to have real conversations with the guards. But inside, he still felt the war between what he had been taught and what he saw every day. The morning began like any other Thursday until Sergeant Morton announced that the prisoners would receive a special meal that afternoon to celebrate the American holiday. Klaus translated for the men who didn't understand English. They shrugged and returned to their work. Special meal probably meant slightly more food than usual, maybe an extra piece of bread. They had learned not to expect much, even though American prison rations were already better than what most German civilians were eating. When the prisoners lined up at the mess hall that afternoon, Klaus smelled something extraordinary. Rich, savory scents poured from the kitchen, smells he hadn't experienced since before the war. The line moved forward slowly, and Klaus could hear surprised voices ahead of him speaking in rapid German. When he finally reached the serving counter, he stopped walking and stared. The American cooks were loading each prisoner's tray with portions that seemed impossible. A thick slice of roasted turkey, the meat dark and glistening. A mound of mashed potatoes with a pool of rich brown gravy. Bright orange sweet potatoes. Green beans, stuffing. Cranberry sauce, dark red and shining. Dinner rolls with real butter. And at the end of the line, a slice of pumpkin pie topped with fresh cream. Klaus looked at the cook, certain there had been a mistake. The cook smiled and waved him forward. No mistake. Klaus carried his overflowing tray to a table and sat down next to Werner and 3 other prisoners. None of them spoke. They all stared at their trays. This wasn't prisoner food. This was a feast. This was more food than Klaus's family had served at Christmas dinner in 1938, before rationing began. Around the mess hall, 200 German prisoners sat in stunned silence, looking at turkey and pie and plenty. Werner picked up his fork, then put it down again. His hands were shaking. "This is what they eat?" he asked quietly. "Just for a regular holiday?" Klaus didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight. He thought about his mother in Stuttgart, about the letters that sometimes made it through, telling him about the ration lines and the empty shops and the hunger. He thought about the propaganda broadcasts that called America weak and poor. He looked down at his plate and felt something break inside him. Klaus forced himself to eat. The turkey was tender and moist, better than any meat he remembered. The potatoes were creamy and smooth. The pie tasted sweet and rich, the cream cool on his tongue. Each bite felt like an accusation. The Americans fed their prisoners this well. Not just adequately, not just enough to survive. They fed them a celebration meal, the same meal their own soldiers were eating, the same meal being served in American homes across the country. After lunch, Klaus walked outside into the cold November air. He needed to move, to think, to process what had just happened. He signed out the blue Schwinn from the recreation building and rode toward the far end of camp where the fence met the prairie. His stomach was full for the first time in years, completely, comfortably full. And that fullness felt worse than hunger ever had. A voice called his name. Klaus stopped and turned to see Corporal Jimmy walking toward him, also riding a bicycle. Jimmy pulled up beside Klaus with a friendly smile. They had talked many times over the past months. Jimmy always asked about Germany, about what life was like there, about Klaus's work in the factory. Today, Jimmy asked if Klaus had enjoyed the Thanksgiving meal. Klaus nodded, not trusting his voice. Jimmy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photo. "This is my family's farm in Iowa," he said, handing it to Klaus. The photo showed a white farmhouse with a porch, a big red barn, fields stretching behind, and 6 people standing in front smiling at the camera. Jimmy pointed to each person, naming them. His parents, his 2 sisters, his younger brother, his grandmother. "We'll have the same meal today that you had," Jimmy said. "My mom makes the best pumpkin pie in the county." Klaus looked at the photo and then at Jimmy's open, honest face. Jimmy wasn't trying to humiliate him. He wasn't gloating. He was just sharing, human to human, the way normal people did. Klaus realized with sudden clarity that Jimmy saw him as a person, not as an enemy, not as inferior, just as another young man far from home, someone who missed his family and wanted the war to end. "Do you have family?" Jimmy asked. Klaus nodded and described his parents and his younger sister in careful English. He told Jimmy about his father's carpentry shop, and his mother's garden, and his sister's piano playing. Jimmy listened and asked questions and showed real interest. When Klaus finished, Jimmy said something that Klaus would remember for the rest of his life. "I hope they're safe. I hope this war ends soon so you can go home to them." After Jimmy rode away to his post, Klaus sat alone on his bicycle, staring out at the endless Kansas prairie. The cold wind cut through his jacket, but he didn't move. Everything he had believed, everything he had been taught, lay shattered at his feet like broken glass. The Americans weren't weak. They were the strongest nation on earth, so strong they didn't need to prove it. They weren't cruel. They treated their enemies with dignity because they could afford to. They weren't primitive. They had built a system so efficient, so abundant, that even their prisoners ate like kings. Klaus thought about the bicycle under him. 6 months ago, he had laughed at this bicycle, called it a toy, mocked American incompetence. Now he understood. This wasn't a poorly made bicycle. This was a bicycle built by a nation that had everything. A nation so wealthy, so industrially powerful, so confident in its future, that even its simplest objects beautiful and comfortable. Germany built bicycles for war. America built bicycles for the joy of riding on a sunny afternoon. The propaganda had inverted everything. Germany wasn't superior. Germany was desperate. Every resource poured into weapons and war. Every luxury sacrificed. Every citizen rationed and controlled. Meanwhile, America fought a war on 2 sides of the world while its citizens still had butter and cream and pie and shiny bicycles with chrome fenders. The war wasn't close. It had never been close. Germany had lost before it began. Lost to a power so vast it couldn't be measured in tanks or soldiers, but only in the casual abundance of a Thanksgiving meal served to prisoners. Klaus began to cry. Not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of understanding. He cried for the lies he had believed. He cried for his country, for the terrible mistake it had made. He cried for all the death and destruction that had come from arrogance and ignorance. He cried because everything he thought was strong was actually brittle, and everything he thought was weak turned out to be unbreakably strong. When the tears finally stopped, Klaus wiped his face and looked down at the blue Schwinn. He ran his hand along the smooth chrome fender, feeling the quality in every detail. Tomorrow he would ride this bicycle again. He would keep reading books in English. He would keep learning about this strange, powerful, confusing nation that had defeated his homeland not through cruelty, but through sheer, overwhelming plenty. He would stop fighting the truth and start accepting it. The bicycle had taught him everything. Now he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. The war ended in May of 1945, but Klaus didn't return to Germany until late winter of 1946. The repatriation process moved slowly, with thousands of prisoners waiting for ships and paperwork. Klaus used the time to read more, to learn more English, to prepare himself for what he would find at home. The letters from his family had stopped coming 6 months earlier. He didn't know if they were alive or dead. He didn't know what remained of Stuttgart. All he knew was that Germany had been bombed day and night for years, and nothing could have survived that unchanged. On his last day at Camp Concordia, Corporal Jimmy found Klaus packing his few belongings into a small bag. Jimmy carried something wrapped in burlap. "I want you to have this," Jimmy said, pulling away the covering to reveal the blue Schwinn bicycle. Klaus started to protest, but Jimmy shook his head firmly. "My dad has 3 bikes in the barn at home. I don't need this one, but you might. Take it. Remember us." Klaus accepted the bicycle with hands that trembled. He tried to find words in English to express what this meant, but nothing seemed big enough. Finally, he just gripped Jimmy's hand hard and said, "Thank you." Jimmy smiled and told him to write when he got settled. He gave Klaus his family's address in Iowa on a piece of paper that Klaus folded carefully and put in his pocket next to his heart. Then it was time to go. The journey back across the Atlantic felt longer than the first crossing. Klaus stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the bicycle secured with rope next to hundreds of bags and boxes. Other prisoners talked about what they would find at home, making plans, trying to sound hopeful. Klaus stayed quiet. He had seen too much in America to have easy hope about Germany's future. When the ship finally docked at Bremen in March of 1946, Klaus felt his stomach turn cold with dread. The port was destroyed. Cranes lay twisted in the water. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. As the prisoners processed through the arrival station, Klaus saw German civilians moving through the rubble like ghosts. Thin faces, empty eyes, children with legs like sticks, old women carrying bundles of sticks for firewood. This was defeat. This was what losing looked like when you had nothing left to lose. Klaus claimed his bicycle from the cargo area and began the long journey south towards Stuttgart. The trains ran sometimes, when they ran at all. Most of the time, Klaus rode the Schwinn along broken roads, pushing it over rubble, carrying it across destroyed bridges. The bicycle's bright blue paint and shining chrome seemed obscene against the gray devastation everywhere. People stared as he passed, some with empty faces that registered nothing, some with anger at this symbol of foreign plenty, some with naked hunger, wondering what else he might have that could be taken. Stuttgart appeared on the horizon after 3 days of travel, and Klaus's heart sank into his boots. The city was gone. Not damaged, gone. Block after block of rubble and burned buildings. The cathedral spire stood alone against the sky like a broken finger. Klaus rode slowly through streets he barely recognized, trying to find his family's neighborhood. When he finally reached the address, he stood staring at a pile of bricks and timber that might once have been his home. A voice called his name. Klaus turned to see his mother climbing over rubble toward him, moving like an old woman, though she was only 50. She was thin, so thin, her face hollow and aged 10 years. But she was alive. Klaus dropped the bicycle and ran to her, and they held each other and cried in the middle of the destroyed street. His father appeared from around the corner, also thin, also aged, but alive. His sister Maria came running from a neighbor's cellar where they were all living now. Alive. His family was alive. That night, they sat around a small fire in what remained of a basement, sharing a meal of thin soup and dark bread that tasted like sawdust. Klaus's father asked about America, about the camp, about how Klaus had survived. Klaus tried to explain, but the words felt impossible. How could he tell them about turkey dinners and libraries and hundreds of bicycles when they were living in a hole and eating soup made from vegetable scraps? His younger brother Friedrich, who had been only 15 when Klaus left, now 20 and hard-faced from years in the Hitler Youth and then the final desperate battles, stared at the blue Schwinn leaning against the broken wall. "Where did you get that?" Friedrich asked, his voice sharp. "It looks American." Klaus nodded. "It is American. They gave it to me. A guard named Jimmy gave it to me when I left."
Friedrich's face twisted with bitterness. "While we were being bombed, while Mother was digging through rubble for food, while Father lost his shop and everything we owned, you were riding bicycles?" The accusation hung in the cold air. Klaus's mother reached out to touch Friedrich's arm, but he pulled away. "You were a prisoner in paradise while we lived through hell." Klaus looked at his brother's angry face and understood. Friedrich hadn't learned what Klaus learned. Friedrich still believed the old lies, still clung to them because letting go would mean admitting that everything, all the death and suffering and loss, had been for nothing. Klaus wanted to explain about the bicycles, about what they meant, about the lesson they taught. But he could see it was too soon. Maybe it would always be too soon for some people. Over the following weeks, Klaus rode the Schwinn through Stuttgart's ruins, looking for work, helping with reconstruction, trying to build something from nothing. Germans stared at the American bicycle with mixed feelings. Some saw it as a symbol of defeat. Others saw it as hope, proof that better things existed somewhere in the world. Klaus didn't care what they thought. He rode the bicycle because it worked, because it was well made, because it represented a truth he had learned and would never forget. He found work with a construction crew rebuilding a factory. The supervisor asked about his experience, and Klaus explained he had worked in manufacturing before the war. "We need people who understand machines," the supervisor said. "People who can think about efficiency and quality, not just following orders." Klaus thought about the assembly lines in America that he had read about, the systems that produced hundreds of identical, perfect bicycles. He shared what he had learned, and the supervisor listened carefully. Klaus wrote to Jimmy in Iowa, describing what he found at home, thanking him again for the bicycle and the kindness. 3 months later, a package arrived with coffee, chocolate, powdered milk, and a letter from Jimmy's family. They sent packages twice a year for the next 5 years. Klaus shared everything with his family and neighbors. Slowly, Friedrich's anger faded. Slowly, they all began to look forward instead of backward. Years passed. Klaus married and had children. He taught them English from the books he had brought back. He told them stories about America, about kindness from unexpected places, about learning that the world was bigger and stranger than propaganda claimed. The blue Schwinn hung in their small apartment, and his children learned to ride on it, wobbling down the street as Stuttgart slowly rebuilt itself into something new. In 1983, Klaus was 64 years old, retired from the factory he had helped manage. Stuttgart was beautiful again, modern and prosperous, part of a new Germany that had learned hard lessons. He still had the blue Schwinn, now truly old, the paint finally fading, but everything else still working perfectly. He rode it sometimes, through the rebuilt streets, past the new buildings and the new cars and the new generation that had never known war. Young people on modern bicycles sometimes passed him, and Klaus smiled watching them. They had no idea what this old bicycle meant. They couldn't know that it had taught him the most important lesson of his life. A nation that builds even its simplest tools with care and beauty and abundance is a nation that has already won. Not through force, not through cruelty, but through having so much that winning is simply inevitable. Klaus kept Jimmy's address in his wallet until the day he died. They never met again after that last day at Camp Concordia, but they wrote letters for 40 years. Jimmy's children and Klaus's children became pen pals. A friendship born in a prison camp outlasted everything that had tried to make them enemies. The blue Schwinn still hung in Klaus's garage the day he passed away in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. His children kept it, knowing somehow that it meant something important, even if they couldn't quite explain what. It was just a bicycle, but it was also proof that sometimes the smallest things teach the biggest truths. And sometimes losing a war is the only way to finally win your freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.